some machines were built to be thrown away. These weren't. Their creators are gone, their factories demolished, the steam engines they replaced long since melted into scrap. And yet, decade after decade, these iron giants just keep showing up for work. Rebuilt, re-engined, refusing to quit. From frozen Russian forests, to the deserts of Africa, to the yards of small-town America, here are 10 legendary locomotives that were supposed to die long ago, and simply won't. Number 10. The EMD F7. Let's start with a legend. A machine so iconic that when most people picture a classic American diesel, this is the shape their mind draws. The EMD F7 rolled out of General Motors' Electromotive division between February 1949 and December 1953. That famous rounded bulldog nose, those clean, streamlined flanks, this was the covered wagon that finished off the steam locomotive in North America. And the railroads bought it in staggering numbers. EMD built 2,393 cab-equipped A units and another 1,463 cables B booster units, nearly 3,900 machines in total. That made the F7 the best-selling cab unit of all time, outselling every other F unit combined, and the best-selling diesel of any kind until the SD42 came along decades later. Under that pretty skin sat a 16-cylinder 567B engine producing 1,500 horsepower, riding on 2 Blomberg B trucks. More than 75 North American railroads ended up with F units, and the biggest F7 fleets belonged to giants like Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, and the New York Central. Here's where the refuse to retire part comes in. These locomotives were so economical to run that many soldiered on in regular freight service for decades. In fact, it's generally accepted that the last F7s in everyday freight service for a U.S. common carrier didn't bow out until October 13, 1992, over 4 decades after the first one was built. And even that wasn't the end. Today, F7s survive all over North America. The Western Pacific Railroad Museum, the California State Railroad Museum, the Fillmore and Western, the Monticello Railway Museum, the North Carolina Transportation Museum, dozens of these machines are still fired up, still pulling excursion trains, still letting ordinary people climb into the cab and open the throttle. Norfolk Southern even kept rebuilt F units, hauling its executive and inspection trains right up until 2019. The F7 is proof that a great design never really dies. It just changes jobs. Number 9. The South African Class 34. Now let's travel to the southern tip of Africa, to a machine built for one of the toughest jobs on Earth, dragging mountains of iron ore across the desert. The South African Railways Class 34 first entered service in July 1971. It wasn't one single design, but a whole family. The core batch, the Class 34-000, were General Electric Type U-26C diesel electrics, 125 of them delivered between 1971 and 1973. The first 3 were shipped in from GE, and the rest were built locally under license. Alongside them ran the GM EMD-powered versions, the Class 34-200 and 34-600, so the family blended American engines from both of the great builders. Across all the subclasses, more than 500 of these 6-axle machines were put to work on South Africa's narrow 1,065mm Cape gauge network. These weren't glamour engines, they were muscle. Class 34s worked the main lines and branch lines across the central, western, and southeastern parts of the country. Some even hauled the legendary luxury Blue Train. But their most extraordinary duty was on the Shishin-Saldanha iron ore line, 861 kilometers of railway, carrying some of the heaviest trains on the planet. There, Class 34 diesels were coupled together with electric locomotives in mixed consists to move ore trains of 342 wagons, each wagon carrying 100 tons, the whole train stretching well over 3.5 kilometers. By the 2010s, these locomotives were, on average, around 30 years old, and Transnet Freight Rail began bringing in modern Class 43 units to replace them starting in 2011 and 2012. But the old GE U-26C simply would not quit. Many were upgraded from 2010 onward with electronic fuel injection and modern Bright Star control systems to keep them earning their keep. And the design proved so rugged that the very same U-26C was exported and adapted around the world. Kenya, Zambia, Brazil, and famously New Zealand, where the identical machine became the beloved DX class. a workhorse born in the apartheid era, still shifting freight across 3 continents. Number 8. The EMD GP38-2. Ask a modern American railroader to name the most dependable diesel ever built, and there's a very good chance they'll point at this one. The EMD GP38-2 arrived in 1972 as the flagship of Locomotives' new Dash 2 line. On the outside, it looked almost identical to the plain GP38 that came before it, but inside, it was a quiet revolution. EMD replaced the old maze of hardwired circuits, relays, switches, and interlocks, the source of endless headaches on first-generation diesels, with modular, solid-state electronics. They toughened the pistons, the rings, and the bearings. The result was a locomotive that was simple, honest, and almost impossible to kill. The heart of the GP38-2 is a 16-cylinder 645 engine producing 2,000 horsepower. Crucially, it is not turbocharged, and that was the whole point. A non-turbocharged engine has fewer parts to fail, is cheaper to maintain, and runs forever with basic care. Railroads didn't buy the GP38-2 to break speed records. They bought it to show up every single day and get the work done. Between 1972 and 1986, EMD sold well over 2,200 of them across North America, and rare was the railroad that didn't roster at least a few. Trains magazine loved the design so much that it named a related GP38 its All-American Diesel. And here's why it makes this list. Most of them are still working. Decades after they were built, GP38-2s remain everywhere. On Class 1 railroads, on regionals, and especially on the short lines that form the capillaries of the freight network. Many have been running for more than 50 years. When a small railroad needs a locomotive it can trust, it doesn't hunt for something new and complicated. It finds a GP38-2 and it keeps running it. This is the machine that quietly refuses to retire because nobody can find a good enough reason to let it go. Number 7. The China Railways DF4. Now to the most populous nation on Earth, and a diesel that became so common there's a saying about it. Wherever there are Chinese railways, there is a DF4. The Dongfeng 4, the name means east wind, began trial production in 1969 at the Dalian Locomotive and Rolling Stock Works. It holds a special place in history as China's first independently designed and developed AC/DC electric transmission diesel locomotive. But its birth was brutally difficult. Development happened right through the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, plagued by material shortages and a drain of technical expertise. When the locomotive was rushed into mass production in 1974, before proper durability testing, the early engines suffered constant failures, cracked engine blocks, fractured connecting rod bolts. But the Chinese engineers refused to give up on it. Years of relentless improvement followed, and in 1982, the perfected version, the DF4B, was launched. This time, it worked. Powered by a 16-cylinder engine driving 6 axles and rated at roughly 3,300 horsepower, the DF4B became the single most produced locomotive in Chinese railway history. More than 4,500 DF4Bs were built, and across the whole DF4 family, the total climbs toward 8,000 machines. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the DF4 dieselized China. It replaced thousands of steam engines. It hauled both freight and passengers, working the scorching Gobi Desert, the mountains of the southwest, and the freezing forests of the northeast, anywhere the wires didn't reach. Today, China has some of the most advanced high-speed rail on the planet, and the DF4 has been steadily displaced by electric locomotives and modern diesels. In 2024, the National Railway Administration even issued a directive that the old Dongfeng series should be completely phased out by the end of 2035. But here's the thing, that's still years away. Right now, across China's vast non-electrified branch lines and industrial sidings, thousands of these veterans are still growling along, working machines from a completely different era. The very first DF4 has earned its rest as a museum piece in Beijing. The rest are still on the clock. Number 6. The EMD GP9. Let's go back to America and back to the 1950s, to a road switcher that helped kill the age of steam and then simply never stopped working. The EMD GP9 was built between 1954 and 1963. It was the second model in EMD's general purpose line, the Jeep, and it was an improvement on the earlier GP7, with a 16-cylinder 567C engine bumped up to 1,750 horsepower. It wasn't beautiful like the F7. It was a plain, boxy, practical road switcher. And that was exactly what the railroads wanted. because unlike the pretty cab units, a Jeep could see in both directions, switch cars easily, and do 100 different jobs. EMD and its Canadian arm built an astonishing 4,257 of them. Around 75 railroads bought GP9s. The really significant thing is who bought them. This is the locomotive that finally let holdouts like the Norfolk and Western, America's last major steam-powered railroad, retire their steam engines for good. GP9s fitted with steam generators literally pushed the legendary N&W passenger steam locomotives off the rails and into the scrapyard. So how does a locomotive from the Eisenhower era make a list about machines still running today? Because the GP9 turned out to be nearly indestructible and endlessly rebuildable. Canadian National rebuilt dozens of them into GP9 RM units and still had 29 of those in operation as of 2022. Many others were repowered, re-engined, and reclassified over the years. But the biggest population lives on the short lines and in the industrial yards of North America, where hundreds of GP9s, some over 70 years old, are still shoving freight cars around every day. There's a reason for that longevity. The design is mechanically simple, the parts are rugged, and generations of mechanics know exactly how to keep one alive. EMD itself even offers a program to rebuild old Jeeps with modern, cleaner engines. A machine that helped end the steam age is somehow still outlasting the diesels that were meant to replace it. Number 5, the Soviet M62 Taiga drum. Now for one of the most fascinating machines on this entire list, a locomotive so loud, so tough, and so widely spread that it became a symbol of the entire Eastern Bloc. The story of the M62 starts with politics. In the early 1960s, Hungary bought some modern Swedish diesels. The Soviet leadership was not pleased that a satellite state was buying Western machinery. So the USSR essentially forced Hungary to buy Soviet instead, the only problem being that the Soviets didn't actually have a suitable diesel yet. That pressure spurred the rapid development of a brand new heavy freight locomotive at the Voroshilovgrad factory in Luhansk, in what is now Ukraine. The first prototypes were ready in 1964, and production began in 1965. At its core was a Columna 14 D42-stroke diesel engine of around 2,000 horsepower, driving 6 axles, and it was brutally loud. In East Germany, where early units arrived without exhaust silencers, railwaymen nicknamed it the Taiga Trommel, the Taiga drum, because its booming, unmuffled roar sounded like drums echoing through a Siberian forest. In Poland, it was the Gagarin, after the cosmonaut. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, it was affectionately Sergei. The scale of production is almost hard to believe. Counting single, twin, and triple section versions, more than 7,000 individual sections were built. They were exported across Hungary, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and beyond, even reaching Cuba, Mongolia, and North Korea. There was even a top-secret variant used to haul the Soviet Union's rail-based nuclear missile trains. And these machines refused to die. The very first M62 ever built, M62001, delivered to Hungary, is reportedly still running. From 1997, Hungary began re-engineering its fleet with modern MTU and Caterpillar power plants to extend their lives even further. In Poland, operators contracted to rebuild ST-44s for continued heavy freight work on broad-gauge lines. And as recently as 2022, the M62 was still one of the most used diesel types on the Russian railway network. A locomotive born from a Cold War political grudge, still drumming across the old Soviet world more than half a century later. Number 4, the British Rail Class 37. Back to Britain now, for a locomotive whose sound alone made it a legend. A deep, snarling growl that's instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up beside a British railway line. The British Rail Class 37, also known as the English Electric Type 3, was ordered as part of British Rail's grand modernization plan to sweep away steam. The very first one was completed at the Vulcan Foundry in late 1960 and entered service in December of that year. Production ran until 1965, and 309 were built in total, split between the Vulcan Foundry and Robert Stephenson and Hawthorns. At its heart sat an English Electric 12 CSVT engine producing 1,750 horsepower, mounted in a twin-cab body riding on 6 axles. That Coco wheel arrangement gave the locomotive a low axle weight and superb route availability, meaning it could go almost anywhere on the network, including lightly built lines that heavier locomotives couldn't touch. That versatility made it priceless. For years, Class 37s handled almost all the locomotive-hauled services on remote Scottish routes like the West Highland Line and the Far North Line, plus China Clay traffic in Cornwall and heavy freight across the whole system. Enthusiasts gave it two nicknames. Because the engine sounded like a farm tractor, some called it the tractor. But most people know it by the other name, earned by that unmistakable chest-rattling engine note, the growler. And this is where its stubbornness shines. Withdrawals began in earnest in the early 1990s as newer freight types took over the heavy work. Most classes of that vintage would have vanished, but the Class 37 was too useful to scrap. A whole series of rebuild programs in the 1970s and 80s created upgraded subclasses that stretched its life by decades. When British Rail was privatized, the survivors passed to freight and charter operators. And today, 66 years after the first one was built, around 40 Class 37s are still in mainline service with operators like Direct Rail Services, Cola's Rail, and the Rail Operations Group, hauling everything from nuclear flasks to passenger trains. Add dozens more preserved on heritage railways, and the growler is still very much alive. Number 3. The Indian Railways WDM2, now to India, and a locomotive that didn't just move freight, it helped move an entire country into the modern age. The story begins in the early 1960s. India had committed to sweeping steam off its railways, and it needed a rugged, reliable diesel that could do everything. It invited the two great American builders to compete. General Motors offered a technically superior design, but India insisted on something crucial: a transfer of technology so the locomotives could eventually be built in India by Indians. General Motors refused. The American Locomotive Company, ALCO, agreed. And so the ALCO design, classified the WDM2, was chosen, a decision that shaped Indian railways for the next half-century. The WDM2 entered service in 1962. The very first, number 18040, was imported from ALCO. But soon the newly built diesel locomotive works in Varanasi began churning them out, first from imported kits and then from fully Indian-made components. Powered by a 16-cylinder ALCO 251 engine, producing 2,600 horsepower. Riding on 6 axles, it was tough, simple, and endlessly adaptable. Between 1962 and 1998, more than 2,700 were built. For decades, the most numerous mainline diesel in the country, the WDM2 became the true workhorse of India. It hauled passengers and freight, ran on newly converted broad-gauge lines, and could be found in every corner of the subcontinent. Rail fans adored its distinctive, smoky ALCO chugging sound. A few were even exported to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. For the second half of the 20th century, this was the locomotive that was Indian railways in the minds of millions. Now, honesty matters here. By 2023, the original 2,600 horsepower WDM2 units had largely been retired from frontline duty or rebuilt. But that's not the end of the story. It's the secret of its immortality. The rugged ALCO 251 engine at its core lived on. Thousands of WDM2s were rebuilt into more powerful variants like the WDM3A, cranking more horsepower out of that same faithful design. So while the pure WDM2 is fading, its DNA is still out there in enormous numbers, still growling across India today. And the original number 18040 sits proudly preserved at the National Rail Museum in Delhi, the machine that helped build a nation. Number 2, the EMD SD40-2. We're near the top now, and this next machine isn't just a survivor. It's arguably the single most important freight diesel of the modern era. The EMD SD40-2 was introduced in January 1972, and it was pure genius disguised as an ordinary locomotive. Higher horsepower models existed at the time, including EMD's own bigger units. But the SD40-2 hit a perfect sweet spot of power, reliability, and versatility. It rode on 6 axles in a CC arrangement, and its 16-cylinder turbocharged 645E3 engine produced a rock-solid 3,000 horsepower. Like the GP38-2, it used EMD's new modular solid-state electronics, vastly more reliable than the old relay-based systems. Railroads couldn't get enough of them. When engineers climbed into the cab, they described it as a joy to operate. When mechanics worked on it, they found it tough and forgiving. By the time production wound down, nearly 4,000 had been built. a figure beaten in EMD's history only by the GP9. For decades, the SD40-2 was quite simply the standard of the entire industry. It became the benchmark against which every other freight diesel was measured. Built primarily between 1972 and 1986, with some export production stretching even later, these machines were designed to haul heavy freight over the main lines of North America, and haul it they did for years and years and years. And they're still doing it. As of late 2025, well over 1,000 SD40-2s were still operating across North America, on the big Class 1 railroads, on regionals, and on short lines, working secondary freight and yard duties. But the true testament to the design is what the railroads have done to keep it alive. Rather than scrap them, companies like CSX and Union Pacific have run massive rebuild programs fitting modern microprocessor controls, new cabs, and air conditioning, creating SD40-3 and SD40N versions that will keep running for years to come. Union Pacific alone rebuilt hundreds. When a locomotive is so good that operators would rather rebuild a 50-year-old example than buy something new, you know you're looking at an all-time great. Number 1. The British Rail Class 08. And here it is, the number 1 locomotive that absolutely refuses to retire. It isn't the fastest, it isn't the most powerful. It might just be the most stubborn machine ever put on rails. Meet the British Rail Class 08, a humble little diesel shunter. The Pioneer number 13,000 was built in 1952 and entered service in 1953. Production continued right through to 1962, and by the end, 996 of them had been built. That figure makes the Class 08 not just the most numerous shunting locomotive Britain ever produced, but the most numerous British locomotive class of any kind ever. It's also one of the most numerous single diesel classes built anywhere on Earth. It's a modest machine, a little 060 with steam engine-style connecting rods linking its wheels, powered by an English electric 6KT engine of around 350 horsepower. Its top speed is just 15 miles an hour. It was never meant to go fast, only to shuffle wagons and coaches around yards, stations, and depots. Railwaymen nicknamed it the Gronk, after its low, distinctive idling beat. And it did its job so well that it became a familiar face at nearly every marshalling yard in the country, quietly displacing the old steam shunters across the entire network. Here's the part that puts it at number 1. The nature of Britain's railways changed completely. Fixed freight trains, multiple unit passenger trains, far less need for shunting. Most of the class was withdrawn. And yet, more than 70 years after the first one was built, the Class 08 is still in active mainline service in 2026. Around 100 or so are still working, spread across Network Rail, major freight operators like DB Cargo and GB Rail Freight, and countless industrial sites. Another 80 plus are preserved on heritage railways, where the class is so common and so useful that most preserved lines simply keep one as their own works shunter. Its secret is beautiful simplicity, low maintenance requirements, rugged construction, plentiful spare parts, and no need to raise steam. Just start it and go. That reliability means these little diesels will likely keep working for years still to come. There are even modern conversions of the Class 08 to battery power and experiments with hydrogen, dragging a 1950s design into the age of zero-emission rail. The Pioneer number 13,000 survives to this day. 7 decades on, the humble Gronk hasn't just survived. It has outlasted almost everything, and it flatly refuses to stop working. And that is why it is number 1. If you enjoyed this journey through iron and diesel, let me know in the comments which of these veterans is your favorite and which classic locomotive you think deserves a spot on the next list. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the rails. And until next time, keep them rolling.